off talking about the War of 1812, the two most important effects of the War of 1812 being a newly enhanced feeling of nationalism and patriotism amongst Americans who had once again defended their independence against the British. But a second effect, a political effect, which is equally important, is that the War of 1812 finally made the Federalists irrelevant in national politics. Now, historians refer to this period that follows the demise of the Federalists as the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings because precisely there is no more partisan politics, at least not at the national level, because the Federalists have been vanquished. Now, the descendants of Jefferson, the Jeffersonians, have complete domination over the political process, and the following presidents all represent Jeffersonians of one version or another. But that being said, despite the fact that many of these Jeffersonians had been instrumental in getting America involved in a war which really could have been disastrous against Britain, they even had the nickname the War Hawks, right? These people who were elected and brought on the War of 1812, they were called War Hawks because they wanted a war with Britain. They were very much resentful of British meddling in the Ohio River Valley. They also very much disliked the fact that the British were continuing to impress Americans on the high seas and, of course, interrupting American sovereignty and forcing American sailors to work in the British Navy. At the end of the war, even these people, Jeffersonians, Democratic Republicans, who had clamored for a war with the British, even they are quick to learn some lessons from the War of 1812. For one thing, the aftermath of the War of 1812 results in the Bank of the United States being rechartered. If you remember back to Alexander Hamilton's struggle to get the Bank of the United States chartered in the first place, it was a very vicious struggle indeed. Many Americans opposed the national bank. They felt that the Constitution did not give the government the right to create a national bank. They thought that the national bank, by being the primary lender to the American government, would eventually run all other banks out of business. And beyond that, they thought that the Bank of the United States, by being the government's sole financial resource, would give them an unfair advantage. These were valid criticisms. But a national bank also ensured that the money supply would be stable, that currency or banknotes would be accepted across the country at face value, and basically it would shore up the financial system. Because once again, during the War of 1812, as a result of the national bank being, its charter expiring, and the national bank disappearing, it was very, very difficult for the government to pay for the things that it needed during the war. So men like Henry Clay or John C. Calhoun, war hawks who had wanted a war with Britain, fervent supporters of Jefferson and opponents of Hamilton, as a result of the near disaster that was the War of 1812, now see the importance of a national bank, and the Bank of the United States is rechartered. But even more interesting is the fact that these war hawks, these people who had wanted war with England, who had opposed the Federalists in almost every way imaginable, now start clamoring for a tariff. Now, a tariff is a tax on all imported goods, and they institute a 25% tariff. This was exactly the sort of thing that Hamilton wanted. Now, Jefferson had allowed the tariff to be reduced, but now they increased the tariff. When Hamilton had wanted a tariff, the reason that he had argued for a tariff in the United States was that if you make the goods coming from other countries more expensive, then Americans will buy their own products. If they can keep the prices of products coming from other countries artificially high, that will give a boost to American production. Now, Hamilton had argued for a tariff to help build America's manufacturing factory infrastructure. If America could produce goods without having to worry about competition from the British or other manufacturers, then America would have the breathing room to establish their own manufacturing capacity. Now, this is a program which is adopted by the Jeffersonians after the War of 1812, not not really so much to spark the Industrial Revolution that Alexander Hamilton wanted so much, but because of it was seen as a protective measure. The fact of the matter is that the Americans needed to rely upon other countries to manufacture goods, which were essential to Americans in protecting their own interests or protecting their territory from outside invasion, guns, for instance. And in fact, the United States very quickly becomes a leading manufacturer of weapons, using what Henry Clay refers to the American system of manufacture. What the Americans do is, and this is something unique, is they start using interchangeable parts. So, for instance, imagine they produce a rifle, well, maybe not a rifle, it's a little early for that. But they produce a gun, and the parts of the gun can be interchanged. If something breaks, you can replace it with the same exact part, which means that the manufactured goods made in America can be easily serviced by throwing out the part that's broken and replacing it with an interchangeable part. That was actually new, and it was considered something of a stroke of genius of American manufacturers to come up with this idea of interchangeable parts. It also allowed Americans to start producing weapons in mass quantities, as well as other items. Were they the same quality as English or later German goods? No, probably not, but they were quicker to produce, they were easier to fix, and with interchangeable parts, they were, in a sense, more durable because they could last longer without having to throw out the whole thing and replace it. You just threw out the part that was broken and replace that part. So we see a new emphasis on manufacturing in America that would have been unthinkable amongst the Jeffersonians during Hamilton's time. But nevertheless, we have the continuation of a Hamiltonian program under the guise of the Jeffersonians during the age of good feelings. Another continuation of the Federalist period is John Marshall. John Marshall was the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice. He had been appointed by a Federalist, and as you are probably well aware, Supreme Court Chief Justices, as well as all justices, serve for a period of life or until they retire. So once you get a Supreme Court Justice in the Supreme Court, he or she will serve most likely until they are toward the end of their life. All right. So John Marshall, who was appointed, I believe, by Adams, a Federalist, right? He remains on the Supreme Court even as the Federalists are no longer relevant in American politics. And John Marshall actually is able to continue the Hamiltonian program by making a number of important decisions that give the power of the federal government supremacy over the states. There's a number of examples of this. Perhaps McCulloch versus Maryland is the most famous, or the Dartmouth case. Both of these cases were cases that limited the power of the states. In the case of Dartmouth, a college in New Hampshire, the state wanted to alter the charter of the College of Dartmouth. The Supreme Court said that no, they could not. Once a corporation has been chartered, like Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, the state government has no right to take that charter away. Hence, that gives corporations a sort of legal existence that supersedes the power of the state. In other words, it gives economic forces more power than you might have, and longevity than they might otherwise have held. They can no longer be hamstrung by the laws of the state. Furthermore, this limited the power of the states. Right? McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, all of these Supreme Court cases decided by John Marshall limited the power of the state, enhanced the power of federal governments, and actually enhanced the power of corporations as well. So we continue to have this economic development, these ideas about economic development that had been generated during the Hamiltonian period continue to exist and even grow in the period afterward, thanks to John Marshall's Supreme Court and the realization amongst Jeffersonians that America nearly lost its independence in the War of 1812. Hence, they would have to start manufacturing their own goods, their own weapons. They would need a Bank of the United States to ensure that they would be able to finance themselves in time of war and to protect themselves from outside aggression. But perhaps the most marked development during this period we often refer to as the market revolution was the development of what they called at the time internal improvements. Nowadays, we would probably call internal improvements infrastructure, right? But there was a renewed emphasis on connecting the country's transit ways during the Market Revolution, this period following the War of 1812. And again, the War of 1812 had an important influence on this new impetus towards building roads and canals and steamboats and eventually railroads. It was very difficult to move troops around during the War of 1812. Out in the back country, old roads that had not been taken care of, which were rutted and impassable in the mud, made it impossible to deploy troops from one area in the back country to another. So even the Jeffersonians, who had always resented the power of the federal government and did not think that the federal government should get involved in building railroads or canals or anything of the sort, the reasoning being that it gave unfair advantages to the people, to the places where they did build these canals or railroads. Ultimately, we get these infrastructural improvements built anyway. The first things we see built are the roads and the steamboats. Now, the roads, not particularly impressive. There was a road, if you look on slide 5, that connected the east to the west. But the national road, the Cumberland Road, it often fell into disrepair. Even James Monroe, president after James Madison, was not sure if the federal government had the power to repair the national road. After all, like his hero Jefferson, Monroe was also a strict constructionist of the Constitution, and there was nothing in the Constitution that talked about the ability, right of the federal government to build or repair roads and to spend the tax money collected from the people on repairing those roads. So interestingly enough, the national road did fall into disrepair. Another major innovation during this period was the steamboat. All right, the steamboat, which was more or less invented, I suppose Robert Fulton gets the credit for inventing the steamboat, and it may not be immediately apparent to you why the steamboat was so important. But what the steamboat could do that flatboats could not is it could go both downriver but also upriver against the current, right? So now you could ship goods both ways on rivers. Prior to steamboats, if a boat, a flatboat was constructed to take your goods down, let's say the Mississippi River to New Orleans, once your flat river made it to New Orleans, the boat was then disassembled, taken apart, sold off for firewood, and you made the trip back to wherever you came from by horse. Now, the steamboats can go down the river, drop off the goods, pick up passengers or other goods, and go back upriver. This was a tremendous improvement, as you might well imagine. And in fact, steamboats were used everywhere, but they're probably most beneficial in the American South, where they helped the growth of cotton transportation. Now, steamboats were exceedingly dangerous. All right, this is something that we may not be so aware of in the 21st century. The steamboats, they had an engine on board. Right, that's what made it be able to go upriver as well as downriver. How do you make the steamboat go faster? Put a bigger boiler on the engine. Right? Of course, the bigger the boiler gets, the more likely the steamboat is to explode. There were some significant steamboat explosions in the early 19th century. Why? Because the steamboat companies, in order to get the edge or to get the advantage over their competitors, would put bigger engines, they would put bigger boilers on the steamboats, making them more dangerous and often leading to their explosion. And there were terrible explosions involving steamboats in the early 19th century, such as the explosion of the Moselle in Cincinnati in 1838. Nevertheless, the steamboat was here to stay, and there's very little that represents the 19th century in the popular imagination more than a steamboat churning up and down the Mississippi River. But even more important than roads and steamboats in the construction of connected internal market with roads and connecting all the different people of the United States, able to move goods and people across large distances were the canals. The 1820s and the 1830s were a period of serious canal construction in America. And of course, the most famous of these canals was the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal created the Empire State. New York City, which was already starting to outpace Philadelphia as the most important merchant and shipping city in America, what the Erie Canal did was it connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. The Erie Canal cut across upstate New York, starting in Buffalo, connecting Rochester, cutting across the entire state of New York, connecting to the Hudson River. What you could do now is to ship goods from the Great Lakes all the way to New York City, and then from New York City out to the rest of the world. New York City became the capital of a vast inland empire of wheat farms and other goods, which were then shipped to New York and sent to the rest of the world. New York City, as a center for trading, became even more pronounced as a result of the Erie Canal. And as much as New York City was already becoming the economic capital of the United States, the Erie Canal confirmed its significance as the economic center for the United States, or at least the trading center for the United States. The Erie Canal, however, because the federal government, strict constructionists, Jeffersonians who ran the federal government, were not sure that the Constitution gave the federal government the right to construct canals. After all, there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about the construction of canals. They start to build these canals, but they can't get federal money for it. So what they do is they issue stocks. They raise money. People invest to build the canal. The canal in New York, the Erie Canal, was built with state funds, state taxes, and private contributions from people who invested in the canal. And of course, anybody who invested in the canal saw their money paid back 10, 20-fold. It was a great investment. The canal paid off so much that people who invested in building the canals made windfall profits. And as a result, despite the fact that the federal government was so hesitant to lend money to the states to build canals, canals absolutely flourished. And particularly in the northern part of the country. Now,